We're talking poetry reading now. So let's look at an overview and some of the core habits. For poetry analysis, there are two reads. First, literal meaning. Second, figurative meaning. How's it look? Pretty similar. You see the two columns you're already familiar with on the left. It says evidence. I say your words or interpretation on the right. You see this new column, though. We'll talk about that in a moment, for figurative language, FL, or structure. So for that first read, we said it's about literal meaning. Some notes on that. For the first read, you use those first two columns, the ones on the left, that it says, I say, the ones you're used to, and ask yourself, what is literally happening? What's the speaker describing? You would use normal fiction reading strategies with those first two columns. Read for theme. Use those two columns the same way you always would as you read any fiction text. So you might write a characterization note or a conflict note. Use those two columns the way you were already used to using them in class. Second read, figurative meaning. Okay, you'd use that third column, the one furthest on the right, which says FL, figurative language, and structure. Here you would note any figurative language or author choices with structure. Some examples like metaphors or imagery, juxtaposition. And you'd ask yourself, when you go back to the text, you'd ask yourself as you identify that figurative language, what does that add to my literal understanding? How is the text arranged or organized, and why did the author structure it like that? Here's how it looks. You would read first for literal meaning. Let me actually go to the text here so I can zoom in. So I notice at the very beginning of the poem, the author says, there's no happiness like mine. I've been eating poetry. When the speaker says, I've been eating poetry, I think it means they're consuming poetry by reading it. The librarian doesn't believe what she sees. Her eyes are sad. Doesn't believe, so she's disbelieving and she's sad. I wonder why. Okay, so I think my note here based off that is the speaker's happily reading poetry, but the librarian is somehow displeased as she sees the speaker doing it. I even wrote a little question to myself, a little prediction. Maybe there's something about the speaker's manner or behavior, the way the speaker is reading poetry, that the librarian doesn't like. My next note, based off the end, she, the librarian, doesn't understand, doesn't understand maybe the way the speaker is reading poetry. When I lick her hand, she screams. Okay, that's odd. Why is the speaker licking her hand? I know she's fearful, it seems, because she screams. I snarl at her and bark. Okay, it's making a little more sense because I know in those middle stanzas we mentioned dogs. And now when the speaker is licking, snarling, barking, it seems as though the speaker is turned into a dog. I romp with joy in the bookish dark. Okay, based off this evidence, my note at the end, the librarian is still misunderstanding and even scared or fearful of the speaker's enthusiasm as he or she transforms into a dog. Okay, so after I read it and get those literal notes, I would afterwards go back and just look for any figurative language. Okay? Now, figurative language is a new thing relatively in our class this year. We haven't touched on it that much, but it's big in poetry. So we're going to focus on it when it comes to analyzing poems. One resource to show you, if you're on our Google Classroom on the classwork page, you'll see the third item down underneath additional materials says English Basics. Here, if you open up that document, it has a library of different resources, some one-pagers and videos that show you some key habits. One of those tools says literary devices at the bottom there. If you were to open that up, it shows you definitions and examples of some key terms, many of which are figurative language, things like imagery, metaphors, symbolism, etc. So anyway, that's something you can use to help you out for figurative language. We'll talk more about that as we read poems. So first things first, as you write a figurative note here in this last column, write what the figurative language is. What technique is it? Here I see personification. I'll write PER for short. And that's actually based off the first line in the poem, where it says, ink runs from the corners of my mouth. Personification means giving human qualities to non-human things. Ink running. I know ink can't run. That's personification. So I'd add to my note, what is the comparison? Ink running. And then I write a little note underneath. And this note here is meant to express, what is the author highlighting or emphasizing by including this figurative language? What does it add to my literal understanding? Well, I think it's really emphasizing how excited the speaker is, how energetic the speaker is as they're reading this poetry. I've done the same kind of thing here, an M for metaphor. The speaker is compared to a dog. What does it highlight? I say it highlights the speaker's primal enthusiasm. Lastly, juxtaposition. That's a structure move. That means comparing two unlike things side by side. So sort of the negativity, fearfulness of the librarian with the positivity and joy, enthusiasm of the speaker. Why did the author place these two different things side by side? I think it reveals the disconnect between these two characters, how they're different, and the librarian's lack of understanding. Okay, I've finished my figurative notes. Now, finally, like I would with any text that I finish for fiction, to get the theme, I would quickly scan my notes again one last time and ask myself, overall, what's the message the author's trying to give me? What lesson should I be getting as the reader? I think the big ideas here are that the speaker is so enthusiastic and joyfully, excitedly reading poetry, but there's something about that enthusiasm that the librarian just doesn't get. So I think the message here, and what I put as my theme note in the last row, is that reading poetry can be an enthusiastic joy, but others might not fully appreciate it. Okay, you have seen how to use now 3-column notes to analyze a poem.